Political Science 100. Our topic for today is federalism. Federalism is one of the most fundamental features of the American political system, and it refers to the division of power between the national or federal government and state governments. And I want to begin with an anecdote about something that I'll call fun with federalism, although it wasn't a whole lot of fun for those going through it at the time. The 2000 presidential election was the contest between Al Gore and George Bush, and it was a very tight, contested election, and there were many election anomalies that were more than just minor nuisances. They were actually anomalies that had a pivotal impact on the outcome of the presidential election. And the ballot on your screen is one such example. This ballot was from Palm Beach County, Florida, and Florida was a key state, many would argue the key state, that went for George Bush, that decided the election. It turned out that the ballot in Palm Beach County that year was unusually long. There were a lot of candidates on the ballot, a lot of initiatives on the ballot, and so in order to try and save space, the election officials, and one person in particular, a woman named Teresa Lepore, decided to try and condense the ballot by having races displayed on two sides. So in other words, instead of just saying a list of candidates and facing you on one side of a sheet of paper, there was what is called this butterfly ballot, where there are candidates listed on both sides. Okay, fair enough. The problem arose, though, in terms of the design of the ballot. As you can see here, to vote for the Republican candidate, that would be George Bush. Bush's name is at the top of this list, and you would vote by putting your stylus. So the type of voting machine, I should explain that we're talking about here, it's a punch card system, and you have a little device. It's like a little like a pen kind of. It's called a stylus, and you put one end of the stylus into this hole, and you push through and you perforate the punch card next to the name that you want to vote for, and then you feed those punch cards. Election officials feed those punch cards into tabulation machines, and that's how the vote is tabulated. So in order to vote for George Bush, you would have put your stylus in this top hole right here to vote for Bush. Al Gore, the Democratic candidate, is the second candidate listed on the ballot, and this is where the confusion started. Some people thought that if Bush is the first hole, then to vote for Gore, you must vote in the second hole. But in fact, a vote for Gore, you should have voted in the third hole. The second hole was actually the punch card hole allocated to Reform Party candidate Pat Buchanan. It's not particularly clear, though. Where to vote for Bush is pretty clear. He's the top name on this list, and there's only one punch hole that's aligned with his name. But for Gore, this second and this third one are kind of both in the general area of where his name is. And it would kind of make sense that the first name is the first hole, the second name is the second hole. Many voters were confused by this. Many would-be Gore voters were confused by this. Some people, wanting to vote for Gore, mistakenly voted for Pat Buchanan. How do we know they wanted to vote for Gore and not for Buchanan? Well, Pat Buchanan was a highly controversial figure during his time in American politics. He was a former speechwriter for Richard Nixon, long a stalwart in Republican politics. He had a long history of making blatantly anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish remarks over the course of his career. There is an especially high Jewish population in Palm Beach County, Florida. It's impossible that many people who were Jewish wanted to vote for this guy who was blatantly anti-Semitic. What it seems clear happened is that many people, thinking they were voting for Gore, punched this second hole, mistakenly voting for Pat Buchanan. Another tactic that a lot of people chose was, if they weren't sure which of these two holes was the Gore vote, they just punched them both. Figured, well, one of them has to be for Gore, so I'll punch them both. Problem being, if you vote for more than one candidate, you invalidate your ballot. So by punching two holes, their ballots were thrown out. Gore lost enough votes in Palm Beach County, Florida, to this problem that he ended up losing the popular vote count in Florida overall. And by losing the vote in Florida, he lost the Electoral College votes in Florida and therefore lost the presidency. Why in the world did we have such a screwed up design in this ballot? I mean, why? How could a ballot be designed with this much confusion in something as important as a federal presidential election? Well, elections, the conduct of elections, including things like designing ballots, are left to the states. Under our federal system, some aspects of our political system are handled by the federal government, some are handled by the states. Election administration is clearly the purview of the states. So that's how we got this. I'll come back at the very end of this conversation with a somewhat redeeming example of how, in some ways, federalism in terms of election administration may be a good thing. But in this case, I don't think many people would argue that it actually worked out well. Okay, so some of the main themes that we're going to talk about in this discussion from this chapter on federalism has to do with the evolution of federalism in the United States, the constitutional protections that exist against or were designed to exist to prevent an overly powerful national government, why, despite that, our politics has become nationalized, the national government's dominance today, and some ongoing issues like the one I just described that stem from federalism. First, though, let's talk more about what federalism actually is. So I want you to think of a federal versus a unitary system versus a confederation. A federal system, like we have, has authority, governing authority, divided or shared between two or more levels of government. So in the case that we're talking about now, we're talking about the federal versus the state governments. It's kind of a hybrid of a confederation in which the states hold the real power, and whatever power the federal government has is what is given to it by the states, versus a unitary system in which the national government holds the real power, and whatever power the states have is that which is given to it by the national government. The text has a more graphic depiction of this, and so here that is. So you can see in a unitary system, voters vote for the central government, and that's where the real power is, and the central government delegates some authority to state and local governments, and that would be the case in most of the democratic world, including places like the UK and France and Japan. Down here at the bottom, we have a confederation, which is what the United States had under the Articles of Confederation. And here, the voters vote for state and local governments, and that's where the real power is. And then the state and local government gives some authority to the central government. But again, this is where authority really lies. But here's our system. Here we have voters, and they vote separately for the central government offices and for state and local government offices. And so authority is divided between the two. And Canada does this, we do this. It's fairly unusual in the democratic world. And what it leads to is room for disagreement. Which level of government, state versus federal, should do what? And you might think that the Constitution would settle this question for us, but it actually doesn't. You can read what you want into the Constitution. If you're a states' rights person, you can find that in the Constitution. If you believe the federal government should have supremacy, you can find that in the Constitution. Specifically, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government are reserved for the states. This is known as the Reserve Clause or the States' Rights Amendment. Okay, so that seems like a pretty clear statement that unless some authority or power is specifically given to the federal government, it remains with the states. That seems pretty straightforward. Except that you'll recall that we've talked about a couple of other clauses that are pretty important in the Constitution, the necessary and proper and supremacy clauses. These are the basis for expansive federal power. Any power that is necessary for the federal government to do what it is ascribed to be doing in the Constitution, and also anytime federal and state law conflict, federal law wins. The right balance between those two things has been an ongoing battle throughout the entirety of United States political history. In theory, it seems kind of simple. This is figure 3.2 from the textbook, and this lays out in a nice, clean fashion what state governments do, what national governments do, and what they can both do, and also what they're both not allowed to do. So the national government can do things like coin money, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, tax imports and exports, make treaties, make all laws necessary and proper to fulfill those responsibilities. It conducts war and foreign affairs. It regulates the postal system. And only it can do those things. State governments can run elections, as we mentioned in the first example. They regulate within state commerce. They can establish state and local governments. They work on protecting public health and safety. They have the powers not delegated to this national government left to them, according to the 10th Amendment. The national government is not allowed to, is forbidden from, taxing state exports, changing state boundaries, imposing religious tests, or passing any laws in conflict with the Bill of Rights. The state governments are not allowed to tax imports and exports, or coin money, or enter into treaties. Remember, those are all the things that states were doing under the Articles of Confederation that led to all the chaos that our country was experiencing at the outset. And both the state and federal governments have the right to issue taxes, impose taxes, borrow money, charter banks and corporations, exercise eminent domain in taking property, and enforce laws and administer justice. There are criminal justice and legal systems and police systems at both levels, state and federal. There are courts in the state and federal levels. So when you kind of display it like that, it seems like, okay, this makes some sense. There's a clear separation here between what the national government does and what state governments do, and there's a clear list of what both entities cannot do, and then there's some overlap of things they both do. All right, so what's the issue? Well, the theory and the reality, they're not the same. The theory of shared federalism or dual federalism, where you have this clearly delineated spheres and divisions of authority between the federal and state governments, that's not how things have played out over the course of our history. What has happened is authority has shifted from the national government and away from state governments over the course of American history, to the point that today the federal government, the national government, has a role in almost everything that concerns the lives of citizens. So I want to get into why exactly this is, what has actually happened. The text is very detailed on this, and so again, I can't stress enough the need to read that to really get a full picture of this. Short of sitting here and reading the text to you, which would be inefficient, and you can read it on your own and would take forever, I'm just going to highlight some of the main points. But those main points include how the nation has grown. At the founding, we were a small agrarian society. We have grown tremendously in terms of expanding across physical space. We've become much more industrialized, much more urbanized. We've developed transportation and communication systems that really spread out across the country and sort of lends itself, a system that lends itself to things that cross state boundaries. And on top of that, the nation's demand, and this is a sentence from the text, the nation's demand for collective goods could not be met by communities and states alone. We have come to look to the federal government to do things that are far beyond what the tax base of individual states can possibly provide. And the two things that the text gets into a lot of detail about, and I'll mention them both here, are the New Deal programs that came out from the Roosevelt administration in the aftermath of the Great Depression in the 1920s and 30s. And in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson's presidential administration's War on Poverty and his Great Society programs. We no longer look as a society to, first and foremost, to state governments and local governments to provide us with the nature of collective goods, in particular social programs, things like Medicare, Social Security, a social safety net, more broadly speaking, and regulations on public life in the interest of workplace safety and worker protections and product safety. And we have an expectation of collective goods along those lines that the state governments simply cannot provide. So because of this, and again, please get the full picture of all this in great detail in the text. Because of this, the power of the national government has increased at the expense of states. And I want to take a minute here and talk about, first, the initial resistance to the nationalization of politics behind the mantra of states' rights, and then talk about why, despite this rhetoric of states' rights, in more modern times, states actually often welcome the growth of federal power, even though that federal power amounts to regulating areas of life that the states used to be in charge in. So taking the first one first, why some states resisted nationalization. Basically, it had to do with slavery. At the founding of the country, we had states in which slavery was legal and states where it wasn't. And the southern states were well aware of the existence of an abolitionist movement, a movement to abolish slavery, in the country, and were well aware that it was a growing movement. The founders themselves were well aware of the contradiction between the language of our founding documents, all men are created equal, and the reality that some of them, including some of the founders, including the person who wrote that line, Thomas Jefferson, were slave owners. And they struggled throughout their lives with this hypocrisy, I don't know how else to say it, between the stated goals of equality of the country and the actual reality of slavery. And the reason that they vacillated on this point was because slavery was essential to the Southern economy. It might seem weird to think of this today, but during the founding years of this country, the first 150 years of the country, the South was the most economically prosperous region of the country. Today, it's the most economically backwards region of the country. So that's why that might seem like a weird statement to you, but the richest area of the country was the South. And the industry in the South was cotton. And central to the business model of the cotton industry in the South was slave labor. So they adopted the mantra of states' rights, meaning the federal government should not interfere in how states conduct their own affairs. But it wasn't so much a principled philosophical position as it was a thinly veiled rationale for preserving the cotton industry's business model, which was predicated upon free slave labor. So, states' rights sounds like some sort of principled, high-minded, political philosophy. Not so much. It really was a rationale for keeping the federal government out of the regulating slavery. Because if abolitionists gained a foothold in Congress and passed a national ban on slavery, then that would affect, obviously, the southern states and would have changed their entire economies. So there was and has always been resistance on the part of many states, and not all of it was tied to this. Obviously, once we fought the Civil War, then invoking state rights to protect slavery was no longer an issue. That question was decided. But states have often complained about an intrusive federal government, and it actually has become kind of an article of faith in some circles that the federal government is too big and too intrusive and should let states handle their own affairs. And yet it's also the case that in a lot of ways, states welcome the growing role of the federal government in terms of the federal government nationalizing solutions to some problems that the state governments experienced. The states have experienced and continue to experience quite a few collective action problems that nationalization, that the federalization of our political system helps address. Coordination problems, for example. The book had a really good example about interstate trucking issues that states have to confront. So truck drivers spend long hours driving their trucks, delivering goods throughout the country on the interstate highway system, so traveling throughout from state to state. And of course, in the process of doing all that driving, they get tickets sometimes. Most states have laws about the number of tickets that motorists are allowed to have before they have to shut it down. But states don't keep track of each other's ticket totals. And so if each state is monitoring only the tickets received in its state, it is unaware of the number of tickets that the same trucker might be receiving in other states. Without some sort of centralized system recording all of this and collecting all of this data in one place, how would a state know if a trucker in Utah that only had a certain number of tickets had a bunch more in Idaho and California and Oregon? So in terms of coordinating data and information on things like that, a national role was actually welcomed. The text also talked about the problems of reneging and shirking on states' obligations in terms of dealing with things like environmental protection. Everyone wants to breathe clean air and live in a clean environment. But from the state standpoint, it's very tempting to hope that other states will take the necessary steps to clean up the environment, allowing your individual state, to renege on that. That's the classic prisoner's dilemma issue that we talked about in the very first section of this class. And so when it comes to environmental standards, it's pretty important to have national standards that all states have to comply with and have national enforcement of those standards. If you look to the states to do it, you run into some problems. Now, the text also pointed out that sometimes those standards can come from the states. That pressure from the states can actually force the federal government to adopt standards. And the best example of this, and the one that is discussed in the text, has to do with auto emission standards. California is the driving force behind the current auto emission standards in the United States. There were federal standards in terms of the expected average miles per gallon of a fleet of cars that any automobile manufacturer had to maintain, but California adopted tougher standards than that, higher standards than that. From the auto industry standpoint, Ford and GM, etc., didn't want to have to produce cars meeting two sets of standards, the national standard, the lower standard, and the higher California standard. And you might say, well, of course they're going to adopt the national standard. No, they're not, because California is the most populous state in the nation, and the car is king here. Everyone has a car. So it was actually more cost effective for the auto manufacturers to adopt the California standards, knowing that by meeting those, they will eclipse the national standards. So by meeting the California standards, the automobile industry and California standards actually forced the increase of the national standards. And then when the Trump administration came into power in 2016, they wanted to push back against California standards, so they wanted to lower the national standards. And this is an issue that ended up in court. Is it okay for the state of California to drive national policy? Shouldn't it really be the other way around? And where that stands really depends on which administration is in power. Another area in which states welcome the nationalization of our politics has to do with the problems that could arise with what the text calls cutthroat competition. We have a federal minimum wage for a reason, a national standard about the minimum amount of money a person can be paid per hour. Now, yes, that minimum wage hasn't changed for, is it 25 years now, something along those lines? So that's an issue, and many states have minimum wages that are higher than the federal minimum wage. But without a national minimum, it'd be very tempting for states who want to attract businesses to their state to be able to advertise lower labor costs and therefore have wages that are well below any sort of minimum threshold. Another great example of cutthroat competition took place during the pandemic, when we were experiencing a national shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment, during the pandemic, gloves and masks and ventilators and those kinds of things. The federal government really was of no help in getting these materials for the states, so the states were kind of left on their own. And California, again, was a pretty major player here, being the largest state and with the most resources, was better able to obtain PPE supplies on the free market, literally on eBay, for example, at the expense of other states. It would have been much better to have the federal government taking the lead on securing and allocating PPE in a way that would leave no states hanging out to dry in the way that happened when California snatched up so much of it, leaving other states to be on their own without PPE. So the point here is that the mantra of states' rights, the federal government has become kind of a boogeyman in some quarters as being intrusive and overbearing, and yet in many ways, the states actually welcome the nationalization of our politics. Let's talk a little bit about the sort of the political logic of nationalization. Trying to effect policy change by working through 50 separate state legislatures is not a particularly logical, effective way to do so. And a great example is the efforts of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, to impose stricter limits on the serving of alcohol and to raise the minimum legal drinking age in the United States. Engaging the federal government in that effort was much more efficient in passing an overall law that raises the minimum drinking age to 21 from 18 than it would have been for MAD to go to 50 separate states with 50 separate legislative processes and try and make that case across the states from state to state to state. That would have been a horrendously difficult challenge. So having a federal government that can pass that legislation that would then apply to every state makes a whole lot more sense. Also, petitioning the federal government to take on certain projects is probably going to be more successful than taking on those projects in specific states. And the book talked about the different perspectives of, say, the timber industry in Oregon versus nationally organized environmentalists when it comes to questions like preserving the endangered species of the spotted owl. That might not be a particularly high priority in states that are in which timber and the foresting industry is an important part of the state economy. So there's much more likelihood of success in preserving endangered species with national legislation than there might be going on a state to state basis. A bit about how in the modern world, how the national government dictates policies to the states. First, the courts, the federal courts, usually side with the federal government when there's a question before them about a state claiming that the federal government is overreaching in its authority. Not always. And in recent years, especially the last 3 to 4 years, the federal courts are actually leaning a little bit more towards states' rights claims. But historically, the federal government has usually sided with the federal courts have usually sided with the national government on those kinds of questions. Preemption legislation refers to federal laws that preempt state laws in a given policy area. And here again, we're referring to the supremacy clause. When federal and state law conflict, federal law wins, assuming both laws are constitutional. The national government has dictated policy to the states through a blend of appeals that the text, I think, refers to as carrots and sticks. Carrots being financial incentives for states to adopt certain policies that are dictated by the federal government, and sticks being mandates, often unfunded mandates. Carrots are financial incentives, including things like federal grants, money given from the federal government to the states. And there's a distinction we need to understand between block grants and matching grants. With a block grant, the federal government gives the states a specific sum of money to spend on some specific policy. So a temporary aid for needy families, for example, the program popularly known as welfare, is a block grant. Each state is allocated a certain amount of money, and the state spends that money on that program. With matching grants, the federal government matches state spending. So the states spend a certain amount of money on an effort, but the federal government matches it. Sometimes it's 1-to-1. So a federal dollar given for every state dollar spent on a program, sometimes as much as 4-to-1 federal to state. Medicaid is an example of a matching grant. The difference between the two is pretty important in terms of the extent to which states want to adopt these federal dollars, and with these federal dollars, by the way, come very proscribed specific mechanisms for what the policy is supposed to do and how it's supposed to be administered. It's not that the states are given this money and then you spend it on the welfare needs of your state however you see fit. There are specific federal requirements about how the money is used and how the program is run. With block grants, the states are not incentivized. They have no incentive to spend any more than what is allocated to them. With matching grants, however, the states aren't paying the full cost. They're paying only a portion. Maybe half of the cost entire program in a 1-to-1 match, maybe much less than that in a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 match, federal versus state. So states are willing to do more to expand programs under matching grants. And so many of the programs that the federal government wants to get the states to adopt, they do so with the carrot of grants and specifically with the carrot of matching grants. Sticks are different. They're mandates. And so this is an order from the federal government to the states that you must do X, Y, and Z, which states already probably don't like, but they especially don't like when X, Y, and Z, these programs that they're ordered to adopt and to put into place, don't come with the necessary funds to carry that out. Those are called unfunded mandates. There's a table on page 126 of the text that lists a number of areas in which the federal government has dictated programs and policies that the states must adopt without allocating the necessary funds to adopt those states. And if you look at this list, programs to advance civil rights, to prevent age discrimination, to clean the air and the water, to improve occupational safety, to protect endangered species, to raise labor standards, to assist towards handicapped children's education, hazardous waste, dealing with asbestos, The American with Disabilities Act is a big one. Programs to expand voter registration, to work on No Child Left Behind. There's not much, if anything, on that list that people would oppose. The point is not that these are horrible programs. Everybody wants, for example, people with physical disabilities to be able to get around in society. I can't imagine. I don't want to know a person who thinks that's a bad idea, who thinks that we shouldn't retrofit our curbs and so that people in a wheelchair or people with sight disabilities can safely navigate walking around town. Everybody wants that. But also, it's not free. Doing that costs money. So when the federal government passes the Americans with Disability Act and forces state and local governments to make all these changes, which of course they should make, that's not the point, they should make these changes, the federal government really ought to allocate the necessary funds, because if the federal government doesn't pay for it, the states are left on the hook paying for it. And so there's definitely a bit of resentment there. I want to close with a quick discussion about some ongoing issues with federalism in American politics. And the first one is less of an issue today because of a court ruling, but it has to do with a clause in Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution, which says that full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. That might sound pretty innocuous, but it's important. The public acts and records that they're talking about in this clause in the Constitution are things like marriages, divorces, adoptions, etc. And what this means is if you're married in California and you and your spouse travel to Oregon, you're still married in Oregon. If you adopt a child in California and you move to Illinois, that kid is still your kid in Illinois. Your adoption is recognized. An adoption that takes place in one state is recognized in other states. I mean, imagine how chaotic things would be if that weren't the case, if your marriage wasn't valid from one state to another, or your divorce wasn't valid. Imagine you got divorced in California, you went to Illinois, and all of a sudden you're married again. So of course we need to do this. But what happens when a state recognizes a marriage that other states would prefer not to recognize? And of course I'm talking about same-sex marriage. One of the big issues with same-sex marriage arose because of the full faith and credit clause. When states like Hawaii, for example, which was one of the first to recognize same-sex marriage as being legal, when Hawaii recognizes same-sex marriage, imagine a couple living in Alabama, where it certainly was not recognized at the time, deciding to go to Hawaii and get married and have a honeymoon at the same time, and then go back to Alabama and expect Alabama to honor their marriage under the full faith and credit clause. So at the beginning of the struggle for equality in terms of same-sex marriage, this was a real issue. And again, the issue exists because of federalism. It arises because of different standards from state to state and the absence of an overall federal standard. Now, that overall federal standard was eventually established with a court case that legalized same-sex marriage. So this is no longer really the issue. Although I would add that the legal basis for that same-sex marriage case decision, the decision that legalized same-sex marriage, was the same exact privacy right that the court struck down in the summer of 2022 decision that invalidated Roe versus Wade. So there is still some hint that same-sex marriage might not be on the rock-solid legal ground that we thought it was just a couple of years ago. Here's another example. This is legal in California as of January 2018. Marijuana has been legalized in a number of states throughout the United States for either medicinal or, in some cases, purely recreational purposes. So this is legal in California now, as long as it's this guy who pulls you over. If you're driving along and the California Highway Patrol pulls you over, and it turns out you've got some marijuana in your possession. Now, if you're high while you're driving, you're in trouble. If you've got a kilo of the stuff in the back of your truck there, clearly you're a dealer, and it's not for personal use, it's not for recreational use, and so you might be in some trouble. But assuming that you're not high while driving, and assuming you just got an allowable amount in your possession, you're not going to get charged with any kind of drug offense in this traffic stop. However, If this guy pulls you over, you're in trouble. This is a federal DEA agent. By federal law, marijuana is still an illegal substance. How can it be the case that the same exact thing, this thing, is both legal in the state and illegal according to the federal government? To add a layer of complexity to the top of this, sometimes the federal government is aggressive in enforcing its drug laws and going after places where cannabis is sold in the states and strictly enforcing these drug laws. And other times, the federal government just looks the other way. And which is the case depends on which president is in power. Under President Bush, the federal government was pretty aggressive in enforcing federal drug laws. Under President Obama, not so much. What do you do with that? Two more things. Immigration policy, likewise, is sometimes strenuously enforced and other times not so strenuously enforced. Under President Trump, immigration enforcement obviously was quite strenuously enforced. But at the same time, while the federal government takes a hard line on what they call illegal immigration, roughly 500 state and local jurisdictions throughout the country have declared themselves sanctuary cities, meaning they're not going to enforce federal laws against immigration. So again, you've got these competing, differing policies, federal versus state. And my point here is not to argue one way or the other on the specific policy, but just to point out the insanity of having completely different and conflicting policies because we have this system of federal and state authority. I opened with an anecdote about the craziness of election administration under federalism, and I'm going to close with somewhat of a defense of federalism in the administration of elections, and it's this. There's an argument to be made, and I'll pull this down a little bit so you can see the headline. There's an argument to be made that part of why the allegations of a stolen election in 2020 and massive voter fraud made by President Trump could not possibly be true and were not true is because of federalism. It's because of our highly decentralized system of administrating elections. It would be relatively easy to steal elections if there were a single centralized method of administrating the entirety of our national elections. But in fact, we have something like 3,000 counties in the United States, and every county is in charge of administering elections, and every county does it slightly differently, in some cases radically differently. This is what I'm showing you here is the abstract from a fairly recent analysis of federalism and its role in preserving the integrity of our election systems. And this was obviously a big issue in the aftermath of the 2020 election. And what the authors find is that the extreme decentralization of our election system makes it very difficult for any actor to take over the entirety and to engage in voter fraud. In the language of the authors, as I highlighted at the bottom there, our decentralized election system makes it especially difficult to capture. There is basically no way that anyone could possibly have taken over the vastly different and multitudinous election administration systems in the United States. They're so widespread and so disjointed, it would have been pretty much impossible to take over the entirety of that and rig an election. So I began with an example of how crazy it is that we charge the states and the states charge the counties with coming up with the specifics of election administration and how differently they can all do it and how screwed up things can get, like the butterfly ballot. But I wanted to close with this example because sort of offset that, or at least make a counterpoint to my earlier point. The very decentralization of our election system is one of the things that has saved our election system from fraud. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and when we come back, we're going to take on the subjects of civil liberties and civil rights.